In the harsh Dakota Territory winter of 1872, a widowed carpenter named Thomas Brennan did something his neighbors thought was pure madness. He built his house out of sawdust. Not logs, not sod bricks, not even the rough-hewn planks most folks used. Sawdust, the very waste material that accumulated in mountains behind the settlement's single water-powered mill, the stuff men shoveled into piles and burned just to clear space for more work. Thomas mixed it with clay and water, packed it into wooden forms, and raised walls thicker than a man's forearm. The folks in the settlement of Northfield watched with arms crossed and heads shaking. They called it Brennan's Folly. They said he'd lost his mind along with his wife. They predicted those walls would crumble with the first rain, melt with the first snow, or simply collapse under their own foolish weight. But Thomas kept working, his hands red and raw, his back bent over those forms, packing and smoothing and building. He didn't argue with them. He didn't defend his methods. He just built. And when he finally moved into that peculiar dwelling in late October, with winter's first bite already in the air, the laughter from the neighboring homesteads carried clear across the prairie grass. What none of them knew, what they couldn't possibly imagine as they mocked and pointed out, was that the winter of 1872 would become the winter that old-timers would speak of for 50 years after. And Thomas Brennan's sawdust house would be the only structure in Northfield still standing when the worst of it finally passed. Thomas had come to Dakota Territory 3 years earlier with his wife, Margaret, and their quiet dreams of a modest life. He'd been a finished carpenter back in Ohio, known for detailed work, the kind of man who could fit joints so tight you couldn't slip a blade of grass between the boards. Margaret had been a schoolteacher, soft-spoken and patient, the kind of woman who made a house feel like something more than shelter. They'd claimed their 160 acres under the Homestead Act, built a simple dugout shelter carved into a hillside, and started the hard work of turning prairie into a productive farm. But the land had other plans. In the summer of 1870, Margaret took sick with the fever that swept through the scattered settlements. The nearest doctor was 40 miles away, and by the time Thomas could fetch him, Margaret had already slipped away. Thomas buried her on a rise overlooking their claim, marked the spot with a cross he carved from oak, and tried to figure out how to keep living. The dugout felt like a tomb after that, damp and dark and full of her absence. He threw himself into work, taking carpentry jobs for the other settlers. Northfield was growing, slowly, the way frontier settlements grew. Maybe 20 families within a 10-mile radius, all of them trying to coax crops from stubborn soil and survive winters that could kill you if you weren't careful. The settlement had gotten itself a lumber mill 2 years back, a water-powered operation on Willow Creek that turned the cottonwood and oak from the river bottoms into usable boards. Thomas worked there often, helping build houses, barns, furniture. And he noticed something the others didn't. Behind the mill, sawdust accumulated in enormous piles. The mill owner, a gruff German named Kesselring, paid boys to haul it away and burn it because it became a hazard, a fire risk if it dried out too much, a rotting mess if it got too wet. Thomas would stand sometimes, watching those boys shovel perfect mountains of fine wood particles into wagons, and something would turn over in his mind. All that material, all that waste, all that potential insulation. He'd read about it once, years ago, in a builder's journal back east. Some experimental architects had mixed sawdust with clay and lime to create a building material that held heat better than anything else. The article had been brief, more curiosity than instruction, but Thomas had a good memory for such things. And now, standing in the Dakota Territory with winter coming and a growing dissatisfaction with his dugout home, the idea came back to him like a whisper. What if he could build a proper house, one that would keep him warm through the brutal winters, using the very material everyone else was burning? What if sawdust, properly mixed and formed, could be stronger and warmer than anything his neighbors were living in? The idea took root. Thomas began experimenting in September of 1872. He built small forms out of scrap lumber, mixed sawdust with clay dug from the creek bank, and added water until the consistency felt right. Too much water, and it wouldn't hold. Too little, and it wouldn't bind. He tested ratios, keeping careful notes in a ledger. 3 parts sawdust to 1 part clay, then 4 to 1, then back to 3 to 1 with a handful of lime added. He formed small bricks, let them dry in the sun, and tested their strength. Some crumbled, some held. The ones that held were surprisingly solid, and when he put his hand against them after they'd been sitting in the sun all day, they were cool to the touch. That was the property he was looking for. Something that would hold temperature, that would insulate. When he finally settled on his mixture and began building the forms for actual walls, the neighbors started noticing. John Halverson, who had the claim to the east, rode over one afternoon and sat on his horse watching Thomas work. "That sawdust, Tom?" he asked. Thomas nodded, packing the mixture into the wooden frame. "What in God's name are you thinking?" Halverson said. "Building a house out of sawdust. Might as well build it out of snow." Thomas just smiled, didn't look up from his work. "Might surprise you, John." Halverson shook his head and rode off, and by evening the whole settlement had heard. Thomas Brennan was building a house out of sawdust. The man had finally cracked. But Thomas kept at it. He designed the house carefully, drawing plans in his ledger. It would be small, just one room about 16 feet on each side, with a sleeping loft above. The walls would be thick, 14 inches of packed sawdust clay mixture, much thicker than a normal frame house. He built wooden forms that would hold the wet mixture while it dried, essentially creating molds for the walls. The forms were 3 feet high and ran the length of a wall section. He'd fill them with the mixture, pack it down hard with a wooden tamper he'd made special for the purpose, then let it dry for several days before removing the forms and stacking them higher for the next section. It was slow work, backbreaking and tedious. Every batch of mixture had to be mixed by hand, combining sawdust from the mill with clay he dug and hauled from the creek bed 3 miles away. The physical labor was immense. Thomas would rise before dawn, eat a simple breakfast of cornmeal mush, then spend the morning digging clay. He'd load it into his wagon, drive it back to his claim, then spend the afternoon mixing it with sawdust and water. The mixing happened in a large wooden trough he'd built, and he used a hoe to work the materials together, turning and folding until everything was evenly combined. His shoulders burned. His back ached. His hands developed calluses on top of calluses. But there was something meditative about the work, something that kept the loneliness at bay. Every evening, as the sun dropped toward the horizon and turned the prairie grass gold, Thomas would step back and measure his progress. 3 feet of wall completed. Then 6 feet. Then 9. The walls rose slowly, layer by layer, and each layer had to dry before the next could be added. Martha Calloway, the nearest neighbor woman, brought him bread one afternoon, partly from kindness and partly from curiosity. She stood looking at the walls, her face uncertain. "Thomas, I don't mean to speak out of turn," she said carefully, "but are you certain this will hold? It looks like something a child might make playing in the mud." Thomas took the bread gratefully, broke off a piece. "Feels solid to me, Martha. And it'll keep heat better than anything else in Northfield, I'd wager." She frowned, concerned. "But what about rain? Won't it just wash away?" Thomas shook his head. "The clay binds it. The sawdust gives it structure and insulation. Once it's dry and I get a good lime plaster coat on the outside, it'll shed water just fine." Martha didn't look convinced, but she was kind enough not to argue. Still, as she rode her wagon back toward her own homestead, Thomas could see her shaking her head. The mockery grew as the walls grew. Men would ride past deliberately, calling out comments. "Hey, Brennan, are you building a house or a molehill? When the first rain comes, we'll bring buckets to catch what's left. You got insurance on that sawdust palace?" Thomas weathered it the way he'd weathered Margaret's death, with quiet endurance and steady hands. He wasn't building this house to prove anything to them. He was building it to survive the winter. But sometimes, late at night when his muscles ached and the work seemed endless, he'd lie in his dugout and wonder if they were right. Maybe this was madness. Maybe grief had twisted his thinking. Maybe he should have just built a normal log cabin like everyone else. Come morning, though, his hands would find the tools again. There was something about the sawdust mixture that fascinated him, the way it felt in his hands, the way it held its shape, the way it dried hard and solid. He'd press his thumb against a wall section that had been drying for a week and feel no give at all. It was like stone, but warmer somehow, more forgiving. And when he rapped his knuckles against it, the sound was dull and thick, not the hollow ring of wood or the sharp tap of brick. This was something different, something new. By the 3rd week of building, Thomas had developed a rhythm. He'd mix in the morning while the temperatures were cooler, pack the forms in the afternoon, then use the evening hours to work on other aspects of the house. He built a proper wooden roof frame, covered it with boards, and then layers of tar paper he'd bought from the trading post in Yankton. He installed a solid door, hung it on iron hinges he'd forged himself. He built window frames for the 2 windows, small openings that would let in light, but wouldn't compromise the wall strength. And he started thinking about the interior. He'd need a stove, and he'd need to install it carefully, with a proper stone base and a metal pipe running up through the roof. The heat from that stove, held by these thick walls, should keep the space warm even in the deepest cold. As October faded and November arrived, the walls were complete. Thomas removed the forms for the last time, stacking them carefully in case he ever needed them again, and stood back to look at what he'd built. The house was squat and solid, its walls thick and slightly irregular where the forms had left their impressions. It didn't look like anything else in Northfield. It looked ancient somehow, like the adobe structures he'd seen in pictures from the New Mexico Territory, or the cob cottages he'd heard old-timers describe from England and Ireland. But it was his, and it was nearly done. He spent the next 2 weeks applying lime plaster to the exterior walls, mixing lime powder with water and sand, spreading it with a trowel in smooth, even coats. The plaster would protect the sawdust clay mixture from the weather and would seal it against moisture and wind. He worked carefully, taking his time, making sure each coat was dry before applying the next. 3 coats total, building up a protective skin that turned the walls a clean, pale color that almost glowed in the late autumn light. Inside, he plastered as well, creating smooth interior walls that he then whitewashed. The whitewash brightened the space, made it feel bigger than it was, made it feel like a real home. He installed his stove on the 1st of November, a squat cast iron box he'd bought used from a family that was leaving the territory. He built a stone base for it using river rocks and mortar, set the stove carefully on top, then ran the stovepipe up through a hole he'd left in the roof, sealing it carefully with more mortar and metal flashing. He built himself a simple bed frame, installed shelves along one wall for his few possessions, hung pegs for his coats and tools. And on November 3rd, as the first real cold snap of the season moved in from the north, Thomas Brennan lit a fire in his new stove and spent his first night in the Sawdust house. The difference was immediate and remarkable. With just a modest fire in the stove, the kind that would barely keep a normal cabin comfortable, the interior of Thomas's house became warm enough that he had to crack a window. The thick walls held the heat like nothing he'd ever experienced. It wasn't just warm, it was steady. No drafts, no cold corners, no frozen condensation on the walls. Just even, comfortable warmth that seemed to radiate from the walls themselves. Thomas sat in his chair that first night, a cup of coffee in his hands, and felt something close to peace for the first time since Margaret died. He'd done it. Whatever the neighbors thought, whatever mockery they'd heaped on him, he'd built something that worked. Word got around, the way word always did in small settlements. Thomas Brennan had moved into his Sawdust house. Bets were quietly placed about how long it would last. Some folks gave it a week. Others said it might make it to Christmas before the walls started to fail. Nobody, not a single person in Northfield, believed that house would make it through a full Dakota winter. But Thomas wasn't concerned with their beliefs. He was concerned with splitting firewood, stocking his shelves with the vegetables he'd managed to grow and preserve, and preparing for the long, cold months ahead. And in the back of his mind, he wondered what it would take to make them see. What it would take to prove that unconventional didn't mean wrong. The answer came in mid-December, when the sky turned a particular shade of gray that old-timers recognized as trouble. The temperature, which had been holding steady around 20 degrees, began to drop. The wind, which had been a constant but manageable presence on the prairie, began to build. Thomas was in Northfield proper when he heard the talk. Men stood in small clusters outside Swenson's general store, looking at the sky and speaking in low voices. "Big one coming," said Halverson. "I can feel it. Temperatures dropped 10 degrees since morning." "We're prepared," said another man, Lars Grundy. "Got the barn sealed tight. Got enough wood split to last a month. We'll be fine." They glanced at Thomas, standing near the store's doorway. "How about you, Brennan?" Halverson called out, not unkindly, but with that edge of mockery still present. "That sawdust pile of yours ready for a real storm?" Thomas just nodded. "She'll hold," he said quietly, and went inside to buy coffee and flour. That night, the temperature fell to 0. By the next morning, it was 10 below, and the wind began in earnest, a howling, relentless force that came screaming down from the north and turned the Dakota Territory into something close to uninhabitable. This wasn't a normal winter storm. This was what the Lakota called a white death, what the old French trappers called a bête blanche, a white beast. The snow came horizontally, driven by winds that must have been 40 or 50 miles an hour, and the cold deepened until it felt like the air itself was a solid thing trying to crush life out of anything warm. Thomas woke the first morning of the blizzard to a world transformed. Snow had drifted against his house, covering the lower 3 feet of wall on the north side completely. The wind was so loud it was like being inside a living thing, surrounded by its roar. But inside the Sawdust house, with a fire burning in the stove, the temperature held steady at a comfortable 50 degrees. Thomas could walk around in his shirt sleeves. The walls, those thick, strange walls that everyone had mocked, were doing exactly what he'd hoped they'd do. They were holding the heat in and keeping the killing cold out. For 3 days, the blizzard raged without pause. The snow piled higher. The temperature outside dropped to 30 below zero, then lower still. The wind never stopped, a constant howling presence that made it impossible to go outside for more than a few minutes without risking frostbite or worse. Thomas stayed inside, keeping the fire fed with the wood he'd carefully stacked along the interior wall before the storm hit. He had enough supplies for weeks if needed. And the house stayed warm. Not just survivable, comfortable. The thick sawdust walls absorbed the heat from the stove and radiated it back slowly, creating an even warmth that extended to every corner of the space. But in the other houses scattered across the settlement, people were suffering. In the conventional log cabins and frame houses, the cold found every crack, every gap, every imperfection. Chinking between logs froze and cracked. Window frames contracted, opening gaps for the wind to pour through. Fires burned constantly in stoves and fireplaces, consuming wood at an alarming rate, and still the interiors barely stayed above freezing. People wore every piece of clothing they owned, huddled under piles of blankets, and watched their breath fog in the air inside their own homes. Children cried from the cold. Water buckets froze solid. Food supplies that couldn't be kept near the stove turned to ice. John Halverson's house, a well-built log cabin that had seemed plenty sturdy before the storm, developed a problem on the second day. The chinking on the north wall, exposed to the full force of the wind, began to fail. Small gaps appeared between the logs, and the wind found them instantly. Halverson stuffed rags into the gaps, but the cold was relentless. His family huddled in the southeast corner of the cabin, as far from the north wall as possible, and burned through their wood supply twice as fast as they'd planned. By the third day, Halverson was looking at his furniture and trying to decide what he could break up and burn if the wood pile ran out before the storm did. The Calloway family, living in a frame house built just the previous spring, fared even worse. The walls of a frame house are thin, and no matter how carefully you build, the wind finds a way. Martha Calloway wrapped her children in every blanket they owned, kept them pressed close to the stove, and watched helplessly as frost formed on the interior walls. The temperature inside the house couldn't have been more than 15 degrees. Her husband, Samuel, went out every few hours to bring in more wood from the stack behind the house, and each time he came back half frozen, his face red and raw, ice in his beard. Lars Grundy, who'd been so confident about his preparations, discovered that confidence wasn't the same as warmth. His barn lost part of its roof on the second night, blown away by the wind with a sound like cannon fire. 3 of his cows froze to death in their stalls before he could move the others into the house itself, crowding his family into one corner while the livestock took up the rest of the space. The smell was terrible, but at least the animals provided some body heat. Still, even with the cows inside and the stove burning constantly, the temperature in Grundy's house hovered around 20 degrees. On the 4th day, the wind finally began to ease. The snow kept falling, but lighter now, and the temperature, while still well below zero, began its slow climb back towards something survivable. Thomas opened his door that morning and looked out at a world buried in white. Snow had drifted higher than his windows in places. The path to his woodpile had vanished completely, but his house stood solid and unmarked, the thick walls unaffected by the storm that had raged around them. He took a shovel and began clearing a path, working slowly and methodically in the bitter cold. He was still shoveling when he heard the sound of something moving through the snow. He looked up to see a figure on horseback, picking its way carefully through the drifts. As it got closer, Thomas recognized John Halverson. The man looked haggard, his face wind-burned and exhausted. He pulled his horse to a stop near Thomas's house and just sat there for a moment, looking at the building, looking at the smoke rising steadily from the stovepipe, looking at Thomas standing there in just a coat and hat, not even shivering. "Tom," Halverson said finally, his voice rough. "I need to ask you something." Thomas leaned on his shovel, waiting. Halverson took a breath. "My family. We're out of wood. We've been burning furniture. My youngest daughter, she's not looking good. The cold has gotten to her. I need—" He stopped, and Thomas could see what it cost him to say the next words. "I need to ask if we can come stay with you. Just until the worst passes. Just until we can get more wood cut and hauled." Thomas didn't hesitate. "Come on," he said. "Get your family. Bring what you need. There's room." Halverson's eyes went bright for a moment, relief or maybe something more. He nodded once, hard, then turned his horse and headed back the way he'd come. Within 2 hours, the Halverson family arrived. John, his wife Clara, and their 3 children, the youngest wrapped in so many blankets she looked like a bundle of cloth with eyes. They came through the door of Thomas's house and stopped, just stopped, and stood there feeling the warmth. "Dear God," Clara whispered. "It's warm. It's actually warm." The children unwrapped themselves slowly, carefully, like they were afraid the heat might disappear. Thomas set them near the stove, gave them hot coffee and soup he'd made from dried vegetables and salt pork. The color came back into their faces slowly. The youngest girl, who couldn't have been more than 5, fell asleep sitting up, her body finally warm enough to let go of its constant shivering. John Halverson walked around the small house, putting his hand against the walls, feeling the steady warmth radiating from them. "How?" he asked. "How is it so warm with just that little stove? My cabin's got a fireplace and a stove both, and we couldn't get it above freezing." Thomas explained it, patient and simple. The thickness of the walls, the insulation properties of sawdust, the way the clay held everything together while the sawdust trapped air, and trapped air was the best insulator there was. The way the mass of the walls absorbed heat and released it slowly, steadily, creating a buffer against the outside temperature. "It's not magic," Thomas said. "It's just using materials the right way, understanding what they can do." Halverson sat down heavily in Thomas's chair. "I called it Brennan's Folly," he said. "We all did. We thought you'd lost your mind." Thomas just nodded. "I know. I'm sorry for that, Tom. I'm truly sorry." Thomas put a hand on the man's shoulder. "You're here now? That's what matters." But even as he said it, Thomas could hear more sounds outside. More people are coming through the snow. By evening, the Calloway family had arrived. Then the Grundys, without their cows but desperate for warmth. Then others, families Thomas barely knew, were drawn by words that spread even through a blizzard. Thomas Brennan's house was still standing. Thomas Brennan's house was warm. Thomas Brennan's house had room. Thomas packed them in, 14 people in a space meant for one. They slept in shifts, shared the floor, and took turns near the stove. Thomas cooked communal meals in his single pot, rationing his supplies to feed everyone. Nobody complained. The children played quietly in corners. The men sat and talked in low voices, discussing what they'd learned, what they'd do differently. The women helped cook and clean and organize, turning the small space into something that worked despite the crowding. And through it all, the sawdust house held its warmth. The walls did their job. The innovation that had been mocked proved itself in the most fundamental way possible. It kept people alive. The blizzard finally broke on the 7th day. The sun came out, brilliant and cold, turning the snow into a blinding white expanse that hurt to look at. The temperature began to climb, still below zero, but moving in the right direction. The men ventured out to assess the damage. Halverson's cabin was intact, but would need complete rechinking. The Calloway house had suffered worse. 2 windows blown in, frost damage throughout, and a chimney that had partially collapsed. Grundy's barn would need a new roof entirely. Every family faced weeks of repair work. But they'd survived, largely because Thomas had opened his door. They worked together that winter, once the immediate crisis had passed, helping each other rebuild and improve. But more than that, they learned. Thomas showed them his mixture, his methods, his building technique. Several families began planning to add sawdust clay additions to their homes, insulation layers that would help them survive the next winter without needing rescue. Halverson himself became something of an evangelist for the technique, showing others how to mix and pack the material, how to build forms and work in layers. Thomas Brennan never spoke about the mockery he'd endured. He didn't need to. The house spoke for itself. As winter faded into spring and the prairie grass began to green again, people would ride past Thomas's property and look at that squat, solid building with new eyes. Some would stop, ask questions, and walk around the structure examining the walls. Thomas would answer their questions patiently, explaining the simple principles that made it work. And slowly, across the settlement and beyond, the knowledge spread. Sawdust wasn't wasted. Mixed properly, used thoughtfully, it was one of the best building materials the frontier had to offer. Years later, when Northfield had grown from a scattered collection of homesteads into an actual town with a main street and a church and a proper school, old-timers would still point out Thomas Brennan's house. Many of the original structures were gone by then, replaced or rebuilt, but the sawdust house remained. Thomas lived there until he was an old man, and after he passed, the building stood empty for a while before someone else moved in, drawn by its reputation. It stood for 60 years, that house, long past the lifespan of most frontier structures, and when it was finally torn down to make way for a modern building, the workers marveled at the walls. Still solid, still sound, still doing the job they've been built to do. The lesson wasn't complicated. Sometimes the answer to survival is sitting right in front of you, in the form everyone else thinks is useless. Sometimes wisdom looks like foolishness until the test comes. And sometimes the measure of a man isn't whether he's right or wrong, but whether he has the courage to build something different when everything in him says there might be a better way. Thomas Brennan built his house out of sawdust and mockery and his own stubborn faith that understanding materials mattered more than following convention. And when the White Death came howling across the Dakota Territory, when the cold tried to kill everything it touched, that strange, solid house stood warm and firm and proved that innovation born from necessity and built with patient hands can withstand any storm.